Hello, I'm Colleen Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association 100 Podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started. Welcome back to the A100 Podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Gallagher, and I'm so excited for today's conversation as we kick off our January media series, where we'll be interviewing reporters, editors, and producers to get a better understanding of what drives the media, how they think about the news stories they cover. Our guest today is Kirstin Garriss, an award-winning journalist. I had the pleasure of hearing Kirstin speak last summer for a Washington Women in PR event and was so impressed with her journey and professionalism and just knew that we had to get her on the podcast. For those not familiar with Kirstin, she is an award-winning investigative journalist who covers national politics, and most recently, she was a Washington correspondent for Cox Media Group, where she covered the White House, Congress, and national issues for more than a dozen local TV and radio stations across the country. She was also a 2023 Paul Miller Washington Review Reporting Fellow, and previously, she was an investigative reporter at Fox 13 Memphis, where she won a 2021 Regional Murrow Award for her two-part series, Black in America, Generational Pain and Healing. It highlighted the experiences of 4 generations of Memphis men about racial inequity. She also worked as the government reporter for Spectrum News in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she covered the 2016 Republican National Convention and Democratic National Convention, along with Charlotte's bid for the 2020 Republican National Convention. She's also worked at WDVM, at NPR, and at NBC News in Washington. So a tremendous background, such great experience. I could go on, but you get the idea of just how impressive she is. Kirstin, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast today.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm a big podcast buff, so this is actually really cool. So happy to be here.
I love it. Well, you've had this incredible journey in journalism. I'd love to know how you got started and where it all began and what really drew you to journalism in the first place.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that a lot of people believe that reporters were probably the ones who were most talkative in school or got written up for talking too much. I was the opposite. I was actually a really quiet kid and wanted to be a veterinarian growing up initially. But to me, looking back at my start, it's amazing how I had different family influences in journalism. So my late grandmother, we would always watch Oprah together. I mean, on 4 o'clock on the dot after school. And while for me, it was just time with my grandmother, it was actually a chance to see someone interviewing in real time. We're seeing guests. We religiously watched the local news. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, so I remember watching ABC 11 religiously every evening with my family. And then lastly, my late father, was an avid reader, and he would always leave newspaper clippings for me to read because he was like, the comics don't count. That is not reading. That is not fundamental. So he would leave articles that were appropriate for, my young age to read and whatnot. So to me, those are small influences in my childhood that led me to, in high school, I actually took Broadcast 101 as an elective. I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. Let me just take this class. I was already into the arts, a member of the dance team, and even doing some choir, but I thought broadcasting could be cool. But my teacher, he was a former broadcaster, and I think that really helped because he was honest about the career. He said it isn't easy. You may not make a lot of money, but if you love what you're doing, you will have an impact and you will really love the work. And that shortly led into getting a chance to do a job shadow opportunity as a high school senior at one of our local stations, WRAL. It's now the NBC affiliate there in Raleigh. And that was just eye-opening. I was like, oh, wow. This is where news happens. This is what it looks like to be in a news station, in the studio. And I was just drawn to this and it just made sense. So I went from wanting to go to veterinary school and become a vet to switching everything around and wanting to become a journalist, applying to UNC Chapel Hill, and they have a great journalism program. And so that really just sparked everything. And it's amazing that I'm grateful for very supportive parents because getting into journalism isn't always easy, especially in TV. You're going to these small markets, not making a lot of money, and it's tough because when my parents knew that my goal was a veterinarian, I think they could see the track. They were like, okay, you go to undergrad, then you go to vet school, and then you do X, Y, and Z. Journalism was this weird thing of, well, what do you do after internships? Is there grad school? Do you go to grad school? All these things. And so I was charting this path, and my parents were like, okay, we will support you and we'll figure this out. So internships, another experience later, led me to my career now. But so, so grateful. But I will say it can be tough because I graduated from a great university, had interned and worked at places like NBC News. And then my first job as a TV reporter, I was making $11.06 an hour in 2013.
Oh,
I say that. Woo, yes. I say that for the Gen Z, if you're out there listening, or not even. But it's one of those things. My parents were so supportive of my dream, and while they said obviously you have to figure out how to pay bills and do this stuff on your own, there were certain things they said we'll help you with. Like if you need gas money to get to work safely, we will help you with that. They spend holidays with me. My family has spent holidays in Hagerstown, Maryland, and Charlotte. We had to do a Zoom Christmas one time when I was in Memphis, but I'm grateful that they were willing to come to me. And I think that has helped me stay in this industry because my family did support the vision. They could see it. They were like, we were still we're still figuring it out, but we see that you're passionate about it. You're doing this great work. So that was so supportive, but it is not for the faint of heart at times. That first job, that was tough. Mentally, you're trying to juggle what is it like to be a journalist, and then you're not making a lot of money. I work part-time on top of working at the news station, doing everything you can to just make it through. But it's still it definitely grows a lot of character. But it is something you're thrown into this industry at such a young age. But I learned so much going to a smaller market, and I'm so grateful. So anytime I now that I'm back in DC, anytime I see exits for like Hagerstown or Frederick, Maryland, I smile because that's where that community gave me my start, and they allowed me to learn, to mess up a little bit, learn again. And so I'm so grateful. So a very roundabout way of how I got into the industry. But that's, as I look back, that just makes sense to me. It's just the little family influences. You never really know how much a moment of watching the news together with your family, or again reading the newspaper, with your loved ones, things like that really made a big impact.
that's so cool to hear. I love hearing how people's family experiences shaped their lives and careers down the road. It's always so interesting to me. And then hearing about the opportunities you got in high school to experience journalism, that's really cool. We work with a lot of associations that our workforce is a big issue for them, and they're trying to get into that level all the way down to the high schools and the middle schools to say, look at this profession, because if you can't see it, you can't really envision yourself in those careers. So that's really awesome you got to experience that.
Absolutely. And I think the more we can work with high schools, I think that was, I mean, we had, it was HRSH. Can I remember my whole high school, Southeast Raleigh High School? But it was like News Channel 2. Like we were official. We did the morning announcements. I mean, we had a little studio. It probably is the size of my, apartment right now, but it was still, that was a big deal. I had a resume tape from high school. I mean, granted, it was on the big VHS. I don't know why I was sending that out to people, but we got that opportunity. I think that is what I'm so grateful for. And so if there are industries who are able to do even job shadowing, I think that was big too. Getting to go and see what a real newsroom looked like at 17, 18 was so big. So I think that was something that felt, I feel like I don't hear about those as often. So that is something, if PR agencies or different groups are able to do that, because I think you forget how much we use journalism or media in high school. But yearbook, a lot of my friends who were newspaper reporters or editors, their start was the yearbook. And it sounds, simple, but that is journalism. You're interviewing your classmates, you're taking photos, you have to use graphic design skills to put it together. So there are so many skills we're learning in high school that could totally translate on. But that job shadow, I think that was the big thing. Leaving your high school, getting to see what was outside of your grounds totally made a difference. And I met one of my mentors at that job shadow event. So to this day, I still keep up with that mentor, and I met them as a high school senior. So you just never know the connections you could meet at such a young age. And a lot of people, I feel like in this realm of communications, they want to help. They want to pour back, but we don't know that on the outside. So yeah, any way to bridge that gap, I think is so important.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's so funny. I did a lot of similar stuff in high school. We had a broadcast journalism class and you got to do the news. You got to be the editor one week, you got to be the camera person the next week. It was really, really cool. And it was brand new when I was, I think, a sophomore in high school. They built it out and it was all new. And I did the school paper and the things like that. So those are so fun. Tell me more about how your career evolved. So where you went from there and the different places along the way.
Yeah, so I tell people I made a unique journey because a lot of people, after they graduate from college, most folks will go to that smaller town to really hit the ground running as a local TV reporter. I graduated in 2011 and I fell in love with DC at an internship the year before that. I applied to every place that would take me, and ironically, CNN DC called me first. And I wasn't really thinking about DC at first. It was just like, oh, I have a cousin who lives here. I could crash on her couch. Great. Because internships, weren't really paid at the time.
Right.
And so that was my mindset was, oh, where can I go? Where do I have family? And that summer it was the summer of 2010. I just saw so much from a front row seat. That was the same year that there were different protests related to DACA. So immigration was a big topic. I was in the Senate confirmation hearings for Elena Kagan, who was now a Supreme Court justice. So seeing that in real time, seeing how these reporters covered these different issues from the economy to, again, trying to get the budget right, all these things, it was just eye opening. And DC, for anyone who lives in this area, there's something about a DC summer. Your first DC summer is so magical. You're just seeing all this history. I'm a big history buff, even studied that in undergrad as well. So I think to see all these different components and knowing that the Capitol, the White House, Supreme Court, all of this was in one city, I was like, okay, I have to be in DC. Right after graduation, I said, I cannot be in some small town. I want to be in DC. So I applied for any internship. Anyone who would take a college graduate, I applied for it. So that's how I got my start as an NPR intern, freelance with them a little bit. I had a short stint being fun employed, which was not ideal. My parents are like, why are you still hanging out in DC? There's no job. Thankfully, I was able to land an opportunity with NBC News Washington as a desk assistant. And I tell people, it was like grad school that I got paid to do because you learn so much on the ground. It was an amazing experience to see DC from the perspective of a national organization, a national network. And I just knew in my heart, I wanted to be in DC for that 2012 election. I just needed, to me, that was my North Star. I was like, okay, I could be in a smaller town, but I could also be in DC. Like, I don't really care what job they give me. I just want to be there. And for the ability to help with covering the election behind the scenes, I was able to help out. We were, as desk assistants, you're able to touch different components of the shows with MSNBC or help out the White House and this place, the Capitol teams. That was just so helpful. So I knew I wanted to still be a reporter. Some of my colleagues who were part of the desk assistants program, they've moved up within NBC News. And I love seeing now that I'm back in DC, it's so funny when we like see each other at the White House or the Capitol. It's like, remember when we were like 12 doing this job, but it's great that we had opportunities to try to build our own stories and make a reel. That's a TV resume, so to speak. And that led me to going to Hagerstown, Maryland, which, as I mentioned, the very humble beginnings. But it was, to me, a great place to start to learn and grow so much. I know young journalists, when I tell them today, the landscape has changed. When I was in journalism school, we were taught go to a small market, then move up to a medium market, then move to a bigger market, kind of that trajectory. But things have changed. Now we have social media. Now we get news in different ways. How we take in information has changed dramatically. So I always tell young journalists, my path may not be your path, but I am grateful that my path was very similar to that trajectory we were taught in school, that I did go to a smaller market. I got to learn all my first in that market. And to me, I was able to I say, fail with grace at times because, we're going to make mistakes.
We all
Every
do.
job you will make, yeah, exactly. Every job you will make a mistake. Now, obviously, I always tell students, you don't want to make the same mistake twice, learn the first time, but also learn from your colleagues. Everyone, we were all in our 20s. We were all trying to figure out, how do we become a reporter? What is our style of reporting? What stories do we gravitate to? I tell people I started really covering politics in Hagerstown because I saw the one local newspaper as my main competition. And I was so annoyed when they got stories over me. I was like, where are they getting these stories from? And then I was like, oh, they go to city council. So I told my boss, I want to cover city council once a week. And so that's how I got started covering local politics. And then that led into covering county commission. And my news director at the time in Hagerstown, he assigned me to cover the Maryland General Assembly. And that was really my first introduction into state politics. It was right after the election of then Governor Larry Hogan. So we're coming into a new administration. That was my first time covering, a gubernatorial inauguration. And I remember it started snowing, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I signed up for. It's like snowing on my head. It's like 2 degrees outside. But that was, to me, covering the Maryland General Assembly was such a great just intro into politics, because in Maryland, the way it's set up, Annapolis is the state capital, and there's no TV station that's sectored for Annapolis. All of us had to come into Annapolis. So Baltimore reporters were there. I was there, reporters from DC, reporters from the Eastern Shore. To me, that was so cool that we were all on the same playing field. No one had home court advantage. We all had to come to Annapolis to cover the same things. And it was great to learn from those who had been in the business decades, well over me, longer than I've been alive. They've been in the business, and I was in the mix with them. And so to me, I learned from those experiences too. Like, what were they doing? How did they approach questions? And so, though that was so impactful. And from there, each job I've had the opportunity to cover politics, and it was opened up in a way that I never saw coming. I was applying for my next job after Hagerstown, and Charlotte called, and they were like, hey, we saw you apply to a news reporter opening in Raleigh. It's Spectrum News is a statewide news operation in North Carolina. And they were like, we have a government reporter opening in Charlotte. We saw you cover the Maryland State House. Do you want to do that? I thought, why not? Let's try it.
Very cool.
But then that led into being part of the 2016 campaign team. And we were all over North Carolina, South Carolina, following all those candidates, getting to cover the DNC and RNC, my first time doing that. It just, all these things were coming together. And while I really love working in Charlotte, I knew I wanted to keep growing and keep improving my skills. And then at a journalism conference, NEBJ, the National Association of Black Journalists, another managing editor approached me there saying, hey, we have an opening in Memphis. We like what you're doing. This would be a totally change of pace. And I didn't know anything about Tennessee. I was like, this is a whole part of the country I just didn't know existed. We're in a whole nother time zone. Like, what is this? I'm an East Coast girl. Where am I going? But I took that leap of faith, and I'm so glad I did, because that was the market where, to me, I really sharpened my tools. That's where I learned how to get into investigative. I learned how to file public records requests. I learned how to use data reporting. And I went to my first investigative reporters and editors convention, IRE. So I learned how to take the stories we were doing and take them to a next level. How do we push back on officials, and also finding my voice in doing that. I think everyone thinks, oh, well, everyone has to go in aggressive. And it's like, no, I'm a pretty laid back person, and I that's also still my style. There's a way you can hold people accountable in a way that is still in your style, in a way that's comfortable for you. So I learned that in Memphis. How do I approach? And so that was really helpful. And to me, it led to the door of coming back to DC. That was always my North Star. Even when I left NBC News, I said, I'll be back in DC. I don't know when, don't know how. Again, the map was like, I don't know what it's going to look like, but DC was always on my North Star. That was always the constant for me. And now that I'm here, it's like, okay, I'm not leaving, God willing. But that is kind of what took me on my journey, was just a door open after another door. And I always tell students, I've actually only ever had one offer at a time. I've never had multiple offers. And my late father would always say, you only need one yes. So I'm grateful for every one yes I got. And to me, they were all, the path was what it was supposed to be. While it's very unique to go from like Maryland, North Carolina, Tennessee, then to DC, but every experience helped me grow in such a different way. And so I'm very, very grateful for all the yeses I got from managers who took a chance on me and, and beyond.
That's so awesome. I love your dad's perspective on that. That's a great way to look at life. So you've gotten to cover so many cool things that you've mentioned here. What have been some of the most impactful stories that you've worked on, and how have they really shaped your approach to journalism?
Yeah, so I know for me, I was trying to think back on different stories from each place that really helped, really left a mark for me. And I know one of them is the story you mentioned in my bio, the generational pain and healing. It's a story that came out of the pandemic. I think a lot of people remember the just the pandemic itself, we're shut down. That was a unique experience because I was living alone, and you felt this isolation. My mom works in healthcare, so I was just the pandemic was heavy for so many reasons. And then George Floyd happened, and we saw this heinous act, and we also saw the reaction. And I remember I was actually off a couple of days. And then my first day back after taking some time off was when we started seeing protests across the country and in Memphis in response to George Floyd's death. And there was something just different. It was in a blink of an eye, the street was half covered to then just full of people. And every day became another protest, another march. And ironically, I was the person assigned to cover these protests and marches. And I walked miles and miles with all of these protesters, and you're listening to them, you're listening to their stories, you're hearing them, and you're seeing the pain, but also the fear, because a lot of people said this could be me. And that was tough. And I've covered police brutality in other cities. In Charlotte, there was a big one that happened in 2016, and Keith Lamont Scott, and that was a big one. That was another instance of people were protesting in the streets there. So I think I had seen this story before, covered it before, but to see the outpouring of marches that had hundreds of people, and again, you're walking around different parts of the city, that was such a unique experience. But I remember I was talking to a professor in Memphis, and we were just talking about different story ideas, but also just talking about the feeling in town. And he was like, this is a pain that is generational. It's always here. Like, we've always felt this way. It keeps going. And I thought, wow, okay, that's a concept, because you're right. I didn't have a name for it. I think that was the thing. Like, I knew this was generational pain, but I hadn't called it that. And so I thought, what if I can find 4 Black men to represent 4 different generations to kind of see, well, how has that generational pain been passed down? What does that look like? And thankfully, I mean, it's when I tell you the stars were aligned. Folks in my network helped me connect with someone who was in their 70s, someone who was in their 50s, someone who was in their 30s, and then a teenager, because I wanted to see what did that pain look like? How did they all interpret what happened with George Floyd? Because they're in different stages of their life. And we got the opportunity to film within the National Civil Rights Museum. And for folks who don't know, that is the old Lorraine Motel, and that is where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And so that museum has a weight around it, because that is where history happened. And we filmed actually the interview in the room that's next to MLK's hotel room that's still been preserved. So there's this weight again that's in that space, of knowing history happened there, and we're talking about this latest act of history at this latest moment in time, I should say. And so during the conversation, it was really impactful, because I asked them, what did they think about what happened? What was their first really interaction with, racism? And I remember the older gentleman, it's still that, I remember the story just gave me chills. He talked about how he remembers the day he saw the photo of Emmett Till. It was in Jet magazine. And I remember he said, I saw it once. It never left my mind. He saw it once as a teenager. And then he turned to the young teen who was part of our interview, and he said, I don't know how this young man is doing it, knowing that he could see George Floyd's death over and over again on social media. I saw a photo of Emmett Till, and I would never forget that. How do you handle seeing this over and over again on repeat, because it's on your phone, it's on a tablet, it's on TV? And the young man responded like, it is tough because it is everywhere. He said, I've seen George Floyd die so many times. And I thought, that is just heartbreaking. And what's interesting is that each man at the interview, I think I maybe only had like 4 questions, but we talked for more than an hour, because there was just so much that came out of that story. And they were even asking each other questions. And I was just, to me, a fly on the wall, because I wanted them to have this space, because also, I should add, none of them knew each other before that interview. I wanted to find a way to find complete strangers who could truly be in this moment together. And they all brought different things. Again, one was a father, so he was thinking about his own children. and how he discusses that with them. The teenager is he's like, what does my future look like? Because I'm entering into this, I'm in this world, and I want to be successful. I want to make a difference. And the gentleman who was 30, he is mixed. One of his parents is black, the other is white, and so he talked about racism in his own family, how he had to, obviously people loved him as the grandbaby when he was born, but there was not approval of his parents' marriage. And so he talked about that experience of even there's a portion in the story where he talks about how racism comes into play in just different ways. And he was like, think about a standardized test. He said, there's a section that says, are you black or are you white? Or you have to choose your ethnicity, black, white. And he was like, well, I filled in half of the black circle and half of the white one because I'm both. But he said a teacher in third grade she said, well, you have to pick one because this is the standardized test for the state. And again, it was, I think, this was years ago. Sensitivity training has totally changed, but that was such a powerful statement to say, wow, at like third grade, you had to decide your identity.
Yeah, for a third
And this is
grader.
discussion. Right. And this is discussion. And you could tell, he could tell the teacher was uncomfortable, and this was not exact how the discussion, was supposed to go. And he filled in the black circle. And he said that changed his trajectory because then he was a top 10% of black students who hit this mark. He said, what if I had changed it to the white one? What would that have impacted my trajectory? So just, a very raw conversation. And ironically, the last question I asked is, what does generational healing look like? And the responses lasted for another 20 minutes. And I thought, well, this is no longer one story. I have a second part. And so I had already been talking with a black male therapist based in Nashville for some other stories. And I said, hey, I want you to be part of the story because I want this whole piece to also be intentional, have all black men, because they're the ones who've been impacted the most by these different police, encounters and police shootings. So I wanted their voice to be front and center. And so he rounded out the second half of the story, which was talking to, again, a therapist who is a black man. Therapy and mental health does come with a stigma. It's getting less and less, but that is something that has been stigmatized. So I think that was something that will still stick with me. And it was a very personal project. And it was something I know when I presented it to my news director, I said, this is not our normal story. I said, I want to be raw. I want the conversation to drive. I want the story to breathe. So I said, I don't know how long the story will be. It may not be 2 minutes. It may be 4, maybe 5, but I want it to just to breathe. And he said, okay, we'll let it happen. So I was nervous the day we aired the story because it was like I was giving a piece of myself to the world and I didn't know how they were going to react. It was a very personal story in terms of highlighting things that we talk about in family circles, but we were sharing it in a sense in this way. So that was a big one, and it's a blessing that it has won awards. We don't do it for awards, but to me, it was validation that people could see the importance in this work and the men who were willing to share their story. So I remember when I won the Murrow, I told them, like, you won this. You were a part of, like, thank you for your willingness to be a part of this project. This is not, this wasn't easy, and you were there, you were willing to be a part of it. So it was great news to share with them that, to me, I said, we did this, so thank you. So that was truly a blessing. But another story that sticks with me is actually one in Charlotte. I remember we were covering, it was an election. It was, I think, maybe a midterm. And, you do the usual stories, early turnout, young voting, all the stats. But I had gotten to know through different advocacy stories I've been doing. There was a man who was a formerly incarcerated individual. He was actually pardoned as part of one of the former President Obama's pardons. And so he was released early. But he was someone who never got to vote. He was arrested and put into prison before he was 18. And at 50-something years old, he had worked to get his rights back to vote. He voted for the first time. And not only did he vote for the first time, he was then encouraging other people to vote. So there was one afternoon, he's outside one of the polling places, just encouraging people to vote, and not like for a candidate. He was like, no, just vote. He was like, you have this ability, this right. He said, I lost it for decades. I didn't have this voice for decades. I want you to vote. So I remember it was right after work. It wasn't like a scheduled interview. He was just like, "Hey, I'm at the polling place. You want to come hang out?" I was like, yeah, let me, check my schedule." But it was the best, just like hour and a half, because you're just seeing this excitement and this enthusiasm. Like you couldn't pay someone to be this enthusiastic about voting, and because it was something that he didn't have. I think with a lot of people, we just assume like, oh, you have the right to vote, but there are people who don't, and it's not easy to get your right to vote because it changes per state. No state is the same in terms of regaining those rights. So just to see his enthusiasm, to see his excitement around this vote, and I mean, after he voted, the smile, I mean, you could not contain the smile on his face in that photo when he voted for the first time. So sharing his story about the importance of voting, why it was so important to him, that's a story that sticks with me. So I think those are moments where you're like, this is we were able to do that. So people driven stories are truly my favorite, and I'm grateful when people allow me to come into their homes, into their lives, and share these stories that to me are just, I mean, just incredible.
That's so powerful. You give me chills with both those stories. That's why we need journalists to be able to share
Yes.
these stories. So obviously the media landscape has changed dramatically over, I don't know, the past
Mhm.
year, the past 5 years, past decade. How are you thinking about adapting your storytelling techniques to really connect with audiences? Because like you said, people get their news everywhere now. So how do you think through that and how do you approach that?
Yes, that is a it's wild. I was it's ironic because before we had this conversation, I was talking with a student who's in undergrad, and she was finishing her journalism program there. And I said, when I started, Facebook Live wasn't a thing. Twitter was still like, how do we use Twitter for
Yeah.
news? So it's wild, and I feel like I'm not that old, but I feel kind of old. My great curls say otherwise. They're like, you are old, ma'am. But no, I think we went from social media wasn't a thing to then becoming a thing. I mean, now I have like a reporter Facebook page where people can reach out to me. I've gotten story ideas from people being able to reach out that way versus the traditional, call the local news station. It's like, no, I'm going to reach out to my news reporter this way, or using Instagram and TikTok. Honestly, TikTok is now really changing the landscape because we're seeing that people want news and information in very short, tight snippets of content. Three big things, or we want video, but then also bullet points. And so I'm still even learning, how do I use TikTok for news? And it's a new tool. My brain is like, how does this work? How do I edit on my phone? All these things. But I think it's social media has, in a sense, helped us connect with viewers and listeners and readers, which is amazing. But it has also made it challenging to deadline has changed completely. Growing up, I'm sure when I was watching the 6 o'clock news, I know those reporters had all day to like work on their story. They're getting ready for the 6 o'clock news, and you're seeing it for the first time on the 6 o'clock news. Now, as soon as the story breaks, you're seeing it on social media. There's a push alert going to your phone. You're getting a quick snippet. There's a web script. We are getting information on a constant basis. So when you get to the 6 o'clock news, you already know the headline, you already know a couple of big bullets. What else is new? So we're having to tell the story in different ways, in multiple ways, again, with snippets at the beginning, middle, and end of our day. So that is something that is very different. And we're also trying to make sure we're always correct. I think that was the biggest thing when I got into newsrooms and social media started to gain more traction. It's like, okay, yes, do we want to be first? Do we want to be the first push alert? Do we want to break the story? But we always have to be correct. We also have to be accurate. That can never change. That still has to be the mindset, is accuracy over just being, first. So I think that is something in every newsroom I've been in, that has always been the mindset of, we want to be accurate over being first, because no one remembers who was first, but they'll remember who was wrong. And in a landscape where we are, we know viewers and listeners and readers have mixed feelings about how they feel about the media, and we want to make sure that they know they can still trust us as the fourth estate, as trusted sources of information. So I think using social media to even also show our work now, more and more, as journalists, we are finding ways to say, well, it's called in some newsrooms process reporting. This is the process we took to get to this story. We called these folks, we left all these messages, we sent all these emails, and we're showing viewers and listeners, this is what we took to get to this answer. Or if we're still finding information, I know more and more reporters are explaining, we're still gathering this information. We still are learning more. And I think that is helpful. But that is something that has definitely changed is social media is allowing us to connect more, but also we're having to find new ways to tell the stories. I think now when I post things on social media, I know quick, making sure again there's captions. I know a lot of people are watching stuff on our phone, maybe with the sound down, but you still want to know what is this story about. So that was something that's different before too. Captions initially was for it's a FCC thing. You need to have captions for those who need it. But now it's like, oh no, captions help drive people in. They're interested. So social media has definitely changed the game. And it ebbs and flows on, what that looks like. But to me, TikTok is the new medium that I'm still exploring. I'm still trying to figure out what does news for TikTok look like, because it is such a whole new world and it's a different place to share our stories and to get information out that is informative, accurate, and helpful.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see where things go. But I hope what you said about that truth and being right, not first. I hope that shines through and that there's a place for that still, because that's what journalism is all about. And I think what we count on to kind of get us through crazy times. So
Yeah, and that's where I will say I think this is a plug for local news. For people listening, we do need folks to subscribe to the newsletters, to support and pay for the paywall if you can afford it, because that is how we keep local journalism alive. It is something that it is tough. Newsrooms are shuttering or combining. We're losing local reporters on the ground, and we need those reporters who can go to the local city council meeting, who can be in the mix and doing public records. So I know that is something that if people are able to buy those subscriptions, I mean, it makes a big difference. That is how I think whenever I listen to various podcasts, it's just my kind of morning routine. I think we're hearing more reporters say, hey, we were able to do this story based on your support because of the support you give us. And so that's a big thing. It is a real commitment, and it's helpful when people are saying we're committing to journalism, we support it, and pick whatever one you want, if it's a local one or a national one. But to me, that is something I think if your listeners here are able to really supporting local journalism, that is what we truly need to make sure this industry can continue to sustain and continue to be that source of truthful, informative information.
yeah, I love that. So switching gears a little, our audience is a lot of them are PR professionals. We really cater to associations and people working in associations. I'd love to hear your advice for them on pitching stories.
Yes, yes, and I know that was a big part of my my keynote to the Washington Women PR's Public Relations Associate, and you all were such a great group. I really enjoyed chatting with you guys, and I always try to give my advice with some humor because I feel like things are really intense sometimes. It doesn't
Yes.
have to be, but I know it sounds simple, but and obvious. However, it's so true. It's knowing your audience and knowing who are you pitching to. There were so many emails I got sometimes that were like, hey, here's the top 10 survey for X, Y, and Z. And it's like, I cover politics. I've never tweeted about, I guess I tweet about Beyonce, but, I don't really tweet about relationships or very, light topics or very pop lifestyle topics. I'm a political journalist. So getting my inbox inundated with those things that were very like survey related or lifestyle, it was like, oh, y'all are going to a spam folder. And I don't want your emails, if you have a great story, you don't want to end up in the spam folder. And sometimes because of the volume of emails we just get as reporters, some PR emails end up in a folder like that. So for me, my biggest advice is always knowing your audience, know who you're pitching to, and it takes 5 seconds. As reporters, especially TV reporters, we post everything, so what we like, when we have pages for everything, Facebook pages, Twitter pages, Instagram, we are pretty accessible. So you can quickly find what are some things that we cover. And the next thing is, what is the story? Who is the story? I think the biggest thing is the who. I know I am always gravitating towards stories that involve people. I mean, the stories we talked about, people were the focus. People were at the heart of it. So help me see the people in your story pitch. Is it folks who are advocating for something on Capitol Hill, or they're going to the State House and doing it? Who are the different voices I could hear from who are real people versus officials? Now, with every story, yes, we do want to hear from the leader of the association or the VP of this, but I also want to hear from whoever's impacted by this topic or this issue, because that's what resonates with viewers and listeners. It's who is impacted by whatever topic is being discussed. And then the visuals, especially for TV reporters. For newspaper, this is still important because they will have a camera person. And again, we talked about social media. How am I visually going to see this story? So while I know ribbon cuttings are very important, sometimes ribbon cuttings aren't the most visual stories if we can't see and you can't show us what is happening. So I know sometimes I've done stories after the ribbon cutting because we can actually show whatever it was that was being opened up, where there was a new electric bus station or a new voting polling place. We want to see the stuff. We want show us the goods. But that is helpful to have people visualize. That helps us tell the story because we're putting it on TV, we're putting it on social media, we're putting it on web. It helps when we can show people the actual thing versus renderings. Some stories that is the case. And then also time. Give us time to look at your story, to vet your story, to vet it with our producers and our staff, because there are so many things we have on our calendar already. If you only give us 24 hours notice, we may not be able to cover it. And it could be a great story. It could be an awesome opportunity. But if we don't have time to process it, we're like, oh man, this is such a good story. Can we send the intern out? Maybe then they can tweet about it. But if you give us a week and some time to look at it, it's like, okay, on this day, we know that this organization is going to be on Capitol Hill. Oh, and they're actually bringing, individuals who've been touched by this issue, and they're talking to their lawmakers. Let's try to make sure that's part of our day plan next week versus, 24 hours before. That day plan has already been set out. People pretty have their days set. And the only thing that changes that is breaking news. And when breaking news happens, everything is thrown out the window. We are moving to whatever that news is. So I think those are my biggest things for sending different proposals and story ideas out, is knowing the audience, knowing the reporter, what do they cover, what does that organization cover, knowing the visuals, the elements. What am I getting? Who am I talking to? And then giving us time to process it. So if you can do a week out, that's great. 2 weeks is even, that's better. A month out is almost too far. The week is the sweet spot. Week to like 10 days is perfect because we're kind of planning ahead, but too much notice, we might forget. And staying persistent. I think that is the thing. We are journalists. We're human. We get a lot of emails. We're on a lot of listservs. If we don't follow up, it is not we have a lot going on.
I can imagine.
So I think that's the thing. Yeah, like my inbox was always just like,
It had to be wild.
it's like the stack to capacity, and I had all these folders, and I was like, I'm still overwhelmed. Like, why are there, like, you take a weekend off and you come back to 1,000 emails. You're like, what did I do? So I think that is the biggest thing, is just follow up. And even if you can, and find time, try to talk to the reporter or one of the member of their team. What are stories that they cover regularly? What are some areas of alignment? Are there stories that it makes more sense, not today, but maybe in a month? So I think taking that time to have a conversation and say, how can we help you? What are areas that what are stories that you are covering? Because some reporters are beat reporters, so they only cover aviation, or they only cover immigration, or they only cover healthcare. So that can help too. If you're pitching to a beat reporter, they may be doing a more nuanced story on something because they only cover this topic. So I think those are ways that PR agencies and different firms can work better with journalists, is kind of getting to the nitty gritty of what are the stories you're looking at, what are the stories you're covering, and how might we be an assist to that. And then avoiding things that are, almost like a commercial, because that's not our job. We're not, and I want to be candid about that. Or sometimes some story ideas don't go far because it's a little bit like a commercial, and it's like, you can talk to our advertising team about that, but that's not our job here. We're getting both sides. When we cover our stories, we want to make sure it's informative, and so that's really the focus. But if you are, I would say, because I don't want to totally down every PR agency, it's more, but if you are doing something that is more promotional-esque, that is where you look for the lifestyle shows. That is where they are able to do more of the highlights. They are able to do things that are lighter. So I think that is where I would say, again, let's go back to knowing your audience. So if something is more of a promotional feel, lifestyle shows, those are the ones who can take time. They're able to do kind of the 10-minute interviews. My story is always 90 seconds or less. So it's like, the format is also different compared to a daytime, a noon show, which they do have a full hour to kind of fill with things that are lighter. So I think those are the biggest tips I have for our PR groups, because I've done a lot of great stories from PR agencies. So it's not to say they don't happen, but I think it's the approach that really, really helps. But I will say, any story of like top 10 stories of the worst for dating, trust me, we know. We don't need a poll for that. We already know. So some stories I'm
That's
like, no,
hilarious.
don't even
Like,
send it to me.
please don't. Please just stop. That's so funny.
Yes,
This
exactly.
is so helpful. I know at our agency, we're always trying to be smart and targeted and strategic, but it's hard. But we found we've gotten the best advice from listening to reporters like you and actually hearing what you want. I mean, it makes a huge difference. And you touched on this piece a little bit there, but I'd love to dig a little deeper into beyond the pitches that are coming in and the bazillions of emails you must get. Are there ways that PR people can help build good, strong, collaborative relationships with you to make stories better and to make stories easier?
Yes, it's the coffee meetings. It's having a quick phone call. It's really, let's just chat when a story isn't the focus. What are some things, that we offer? What are things you're looking for? And also, are there things that we're looking for that you all might be able to provide? I know one organization I was talking with, they were doing like financial polling, and I was like, oh, well, do you have a breakdown by ethnicity and gender? And they're like, oh, we're going to do it by gender. I said, oh, it'd be helpful to know if we had it by ethnicity too, because there are so many stories about, you know, who knows more about money, or who gets financial, literacy at different ages. So I think it's more having a conversation, and not when a story is the focus. It's just, hey, let's talk. You're not on deadline. We're not on deadline. Let's just see where we can meet in the middle, where there's alignment. That all that stuff is so helpful. And I think a lot of people are surprised at what needs we have as journalists in terms of, for some people, it may be we do want the officials. For others, like I said, the newsrooms I've been working in, we're very people driven. So for me, I really want to hear from the real people, the person affected by this topic or this issue. And maybe I will talk with the CEO, or maybe I'll talk with the VP, but the focus is the person. That's my I'm very character driven storyteller. And so that's how I see a story. But other reporters may be different, or again, other topics, especially if it's if it's print or digital, there's a different focus. The visuals may not be as prominent versus for TV. So I think it's finding what is the need and trying to build that relationship when really what's key when the deadline isn't the focus. Because when we are on deadline, that can also be stressful. But then also, I would say, having experts readily available is also helpful. I was always grateful for the associations or groups I called on a moment's notice and said, "Hey, we just got the story in. I have to turn it in 2 hours. Is there anyone who can talk to me within the next hour?" And they delivered. That was always, we would rave about the PR folks who could help us find someone within 2 hours, because sometimes that's the deadline. Sometimes we're throwing a story or news breaks and you're trying to find a reaction. You're trying to get an expert quickly. So when you can help us on our deadline, that is remembered. Your number is saved and starred and highlighted. So I think it's also knowing how to help us in both situations, when we have time to plan and when we don't, when we're responding on the fly to something. So, and all that comes from, again, having those relationships, having those conversations. And a lot of us want to make relationships. We want to get to know folks. And so many folks are open to having conversations. Again, if you can't meet for coffee, even just a quick phone call, all that can really help bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things we tried to do in working with associations is to get them to think beyond getting your executive on camera, who can tell the story best? And probably it's your members, and it's diverse voices and different perspectives and people that have lived it. And I'm just curious if you have any other advice on how PR people could help get some more of those diverse perspectives in the news?
The biggest one is having diverse perspectives on your team. Starting with that, having diverse perspectives on your team, and in making sure those folks are readily available, but also media trained. That is something that is critical because a TV interview is very different from a print interview. We hear inflection, we hear tone, we hear pauses, we hear an interview on radio and in TV. And so that is so important that you have to have a good messenger, someone who can deliver that message in an authentic way. We always love when people are just organic. It's always a conversation. I mean, we're having a conversation here. We always want that with our interviews. We don't want something that's memorized and and the story is blah blah. No, just relax and and most times, 9 times out of 10, you're often doing interviews that are recorded. Very rarely is someone going to put you on live TV, to do an interview. And if they are, it's usually someone who's done it a lot of times, so they're used to it. So it's a very different situation. So I think on top of being very intentional about having your members be the spokesperson, so to speak, having diversity, it's really making sure they're able to deliver that message in a very authentic way, and that is in the way that they normally do it, and in their authentic selves. I definitely, when I say media train, it's not to say every person has to sound the same. It's more, are they able to feel comfortable as they deliver that message? Do they know what their style is? So all that stuff is important. But definitely, I'm, as a reporter, I know I am intentional about looking for diversity in my interviews. And to me, that is something, if I can highlight diversity on top of finding a great expert, that is always a win for me, because to me, there are so many diverse voices, and those voices will think of things that other groups don't. So I think that's also the beauty of the story. Could be even better because there's a diverse perspective highlighting whatever the issue or topic is.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball. Obviously, journalism has changed a whole lot in recent years. What are the big trends you see in the next few years?
Ooh, yes, that is a big one. Unfortunately, we probably will see smaller newsrooms, which does make me
I
sad.
know.
And that is really big in our local markets. And that's why I wanted to make sure listeners knew, if there is a local paper, a local station you love, find a way to support a local radio station. Those are, I fear for that, because journalism is so important, but we are seeing newsrooms condense. We're seeing more layoffs this year. I think we are also going to see news become very digital focused. Like I've said a few times, social media is just, I mean, we all have phones where, I mean, I don't know how many times we're scrolling. I mean, now we have terms for it. We're just here to, mindless scrolling. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how social media changes, how we use social media as storytellers. And that's, again, as newsrooms, as PR agencies, as different association groups, how are we all using social media? Because that is just where things have gone. We're now on social media more. I think we've talked about the cutting the cord movement in terms of like cutting cable. That's a real thing. So we'll see how that all looks like. I don't know what streaming has in store. That could be another thing. So it is hard to say, but journalism is definitely changing. The next 5 years will look very different. The next 10 years will look very different. And I'm hoping to be here along the ride. And I still love journalism and love what we do as journalists. And we'll see. It's one of those, we are going to adapt and evolve, but we will see a lot of changes. And I will say, for folks who are watching the different layoffs of journalists, I would miss another challenge to your PR, to the agencies and the firms who listen to this. If there is a former journalist applying, give them a second look. We don't have the traditional resume. We don't have the traditional agency experience, but we are good storytellers. We are smart, we're efficient, we know how to work on deadline, and we're fast learners. I mean, every time we go to a new newsroom, you have to learn everything all over again. The new city, the new members of this group or that group, who's in charge of city council and this thing. We learn quickly. So I think, to me, there are ways to if you see a layoff happen, look to see, are there journalists who are deciding to move into communications? Give them a second look, give them a first look, really. And, that is also one way to improve your team. Having someone who's been on the other side join your team. But I know for a lot of us, we we know our resumes are what we've been doing for years because we're doing journalism resumes. So I think that's the biggest thing is as journalism does shift, if you see someone who is a former journalist looking to get into this industry, please give them a shot because we bring so much to the table.
Amazing. Well, Kirsten, I'm so grateful for you sharing your experiences and insights with us. Before we let you go, though, we like to wrap up all of our podcasts with a fun lightning round questions to let our audience get to know
Ooh,
you a little
yes.
bit. So, first up, have you gotten to get away to anywhere fun lately?
Ooh, that's a good one. I will be in 2025 more. I should say recently got to go to Turks and Caicos for a
Oh,
wedding. Loved it. Very peaceful, serene, and my family has ties to the Caribbean, so it was a very nice, just beautiful escape from everything. So yes, that's one. But want to get to Europe more. So that's the goal for this year in
I
2025.
love it. That's awesome. So, you mentioned being a big podcast listener. What podcasts are you listening to that you think our listeners should tune in for?
Ooh, I am super newsy. So I have like my trinity of news podcasts. I literally start with Politico Playbook every morning. Then I hop to NPR's national politics podcast. And then I am an NPR stan. I go to It's Been a Minute. That's my culture, like just another, it has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with politics, or if it does, it has it a very pop culture way. So I love that that's a mix of news, politics. I am a newsy person, so I do go in that realm. But those are my three go to. It changes every day or every week, depending on the It's Been a Minute. It comes out not as often, but really, really love that. That to me, those are fun ones. I will say a great series I did listen to was Tested. That's from the Embedded podcast on NPR. If you're a sports fan, that one is a good one because it looked at different testing, how women athletes in the Olympics are have to do different tests over male athletes. So very interesting. I don't want to give too much away, but fascinating look at something that I just never knew existed. And it was something that was happening during the 2024 Olympics. So such a good different set of storytelling. But yeah, those are I am a podcast girl through and through.
I love that. I'm gonna have to add that last one to my list. I am constantly listening to podcasts. I have them on 2x speed, which I know is so bad, but I just I want to hear it all and listen to it all. That's how I fit it all in.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, what's one place in the US you've never been to but are dying to go?
Oh, Denver, Colorado, hands
Yeah,
down.
I was just there. It's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just want the serene, peaceful, I don't like skiing, but I would love to see it from a cabin that is fully operating. I want to do glamping, not camping. So I definitely want access to bathrooms, hot showers, yeah, all that stuff. No, do not throw me in an actual cabin. I'm not doing it. But yeah, glamping in Denver, Colorado, yes. Or even Scottsdale or Arizona. Those are two places I'm I just know that the scenery is unmatched. So those are on my bucket list for inside the
That's so
US.
funny. Great, great, great items to have on the list. The Denver cracks me up. We go in the summer because we don't ski, but we love the scenery and all the prettiness too. So it's awesome.
Yes.
Okay, last one. Finish the sentence for me. When you see me looking at my phone, it probably means that I'm
Ooh, I'm watching Beyonce videos or dog videos. My feed is literally Beyonce and dogs and working out, but it's literally that it doesn't. My Instagram Explore page is just a mixture of that. Is definitely yeah. I am a member of the Beehive. I love Beyonce so much. She got all my money during the Renaissance tour. I was like, please stop, don't tour anymore. Wait a little bit. And if Beyonce's listening, release the visuals. I want to see them from Renaissance, please.
So fun. I love it so much. Well, Kirsten, thanks again. This was a blast and we loved having you on the A100.
Yes, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. And thank you all for those who are listening.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association 100 Podcast is a production of Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of the A100 newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association, or do you have some words of wisdom for the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwardupwrd.com. If you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association inspiration and insights. Thanks for tuning in.